Okay. Amber, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello.
I can't. Apologies, Amber. I was having all kinds of trouble. We are not at home, and we're in Florida. I was trying to get the internet to work here. And so anyway, I
Great.
got it working finally. Sorry about that. I was looking for Amber, just out of curiosity. L. What does the L stand for, if you
Ah,
don't mind? I was searching for you alphabetically, and I was like, wait a minute, where's the
oh
L in front?
yeah. That's my
How's it
first
going?
name, Lori, which I went by until I was 12 years
Cool.
old. And then I decided I wanted to go by my middle name instead.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Well, that's similar to one of my daughters does something similar to that. So, well, welcome, Amber. As you know, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I always, find you to be one of the more even-handed, objective people in the very subjective and emotional world of diet. So good to have you here, and I'm glad you're doing well. I assume you're still doing well. Are you still in Colorado, in
Thank
Boulder?
you. Yeah, I am. I'm in Boulder and doing fine. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you too.
Well, thanks, Amber. I am, for you guys to know, I'm in Florida, so it's kind of weird for me because it's noon. I'm usually doing this at 9 a.m. It's just kind of, it's kind of been a weird, doing that little time zone transition. So I guess I'll just open it up to just kind of whatever you're up to lately, because I know you always kind of, you're always pushing envelopes of thought. I know, I think you wrote something about, I just started getting back on Twitter again. I noticed you were talking about AMPK or cyclic, or I guess AMPK, adenosine monophosphate kinase, as a monitor of energy. And we traditionally thought it as, kind of a low energy state. And then we would have this antagonistic relationship with mTOR and nutrient storage versus nutrient utilization. But you've kind of said that it may be a high nutrient sensor, but the problem is it's not glucose it's sensing. Is that, what's up with that? Let's talk about that a little bit, just for fun to warm up with.
Yeah, sure. It was kind of more of a passing comment, but AMPK is one of those things that gets activated when you're in a state of using up a lot of energy. People often call it catabolism, but that has the connotation that you're breaking down your body in an unhealthy way. So I prefer to just talk about high energy use. And many things will upregulate and activate AMPK, including lots of our favorite drugs like nicotine and caffeine, for example, but also just a ketogenic diet obviously will ramp up AMPK, but fasting also does. And so I think that's primarily where people get the idea that AMPK is this like, oh, it's an emergency, we don't have enough fuel. But actually in the fasting state, of course, when you think about it, the fasting state, unless you've gotten to further stages of starvation or you have some kind of problem with fat metabolism, that what it really means is that your adipose tissue is going to be releasing all kinds of fat. And so it's actually a state in which you have a lot of energy, but right, like you said, it's not glucose energy. And so the cells can pick up whether or not, through various signals, whether or not the energy is coming in through glucose or fat. And low glucose would often be a situation where AMPK goes up. But I think that observation has clouded the fact that AMPK is pretty much always an indicator that there's a lot of energy available and not that there's low energy available. And it's just sort of it's an insight that I started to come around to myself, and then talking to Peter Dobromilski, he said it in such a way that it really resonated with me, and I was like, oh yeah, you're right. So that's where that tweet came from.
Yeah, look at it. We have a lot of glucocentric, I guess, mind frames in a lot of cases when it comes to energy, because we're so used to that. I saw a tweet from Sophia Clemens talking about, these people are on a carnivore diet, these people are on a PAD diet, and there's some differences in, I think, BUN, creatinine, and what I can't remember, maybe phosphatase or something like that. I can't remember. There's a few things. My thought about that is that, what happens if we just imagine, we're these wild creatures and the science goes wherever it will, and it's kind of serendipity that we decided to measure creatine or creatinine rather. What if we just started and we first discovered something like cystatin C, which doesn't sort of go up, and we sort of use that as a benchmark. So it's kind of interesting how we just kind of, we're limited by the technology or the order of discoveries on how we sort of, use a goalpost, that type of thing. But I know you've been certainly an advocate of, well, I won't say advocate. I mean, you've certainly raised the question of, the lipivore, human beings being fat loving. And I think there's a lot of data that certainly supports that. I think fat is absolutely critically essential to human development, human function, human physiology. I mean, there's people that obviously pursue a low fat diet and they don't die right away, but um, do you find that, what is your thought on that? Because there's this fat versus protein. I'm kind of like, do what works for you ultimately, but there's different ways people they want to measure the goalpost. What are your thoughts on high fat, medium fat, low fat? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first, just to make sure we're on the same page, since high and low are relative
Yeah, sure.
terms, even I would say that anyone who's successfully on a carnivore diet for a long time is going to already be what most people would consider to be high fat, right?
Yeah.
So like percent calories, it's
yeah,
already more than 50%, probably
right. Sure,
65%.
sure.
And the
Right,
comparison
sure,
that
absolutely.
Dr. Clemens was making to the different blood work was between what I would consider, yes, a higher protein carnivore diet versus their higher fat, which is very high fat, like 80% fat. And so I agree with you completely that we have all these lab measures that are based on a glucose-based metabolism, right? So if you go to a higher protein and lower fat carnivore diet and you see something different from that, and then the even higher fat brings it back to something that's more comparable to the glucose-based metabolism. I mean, all of these are completely different contexts, and which ones we should consider to be a marker of health. I think there's always the complication of what context are you in? Like, you would never want to see high ketosis in someone who's on a high carbohydrate or a very low fat diet. That would suggest that something's gone terribly wrong. But when you see that in a very high fat diet, a ketogenic diet, you're not going to worry about there being ketosis. So as far as the lipivore goes, I think that even when we're talking about something like 65% fat diet, that would still qualify as human being the lipivore. And I really appreciate your saying avoiding the word advocate, because, well, in a way I definitely do advocate for trying a carnivore diet and for all the health benefits you can get doing these different things. But I acknowledge that different levels of protein and fat, none of them needs to be the be all and end all of a healthy diet. I know plenty of healthy people who are, well, I mean, for that matter, I know healthy people who are eating carbs, right? But I know healthy people who got to their best way of feeling and being eating a higher protein version. And I know other people who have said, I just couldn't get the benefits until I took the protein levels a bit down and the fat levels a bit up. And I think it probably has to do with your background metabolic health. Like, if you've got high insulin going on for something like some immunological reason, or some, insulin is related to repair and growth. And so if you are suffering from some kind of an ongoing problem that has raised your basal insulin, and then you try to eat a high protein, lower fat diet, you're not going to get the same results as somebody who has really low insulin at like 2 or 4 or something, and then they eat higher protein. It's not even going to have much of an effect for them. So I think if you're having a problem, particularly, in the paleomedicina, Sophia Clemens is often working with people who are very, very sick. And I think that in her situation, in her context of the patients, the higher fat diet might actually be a lot more important.
Yeah, I definitely can see that aspect of it. I'm just going to comment on your shirt, Amber. I see you got the Zcash poking
Oh,
up there,
yeah.
and so this isn't, yeah, it fixes it. There's a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space that, everyone has their own, flag. Some people are Bitcoin, some people are whatever, Ethereum, Zcash, and all those types of things. What are your thoughts on this whole cryptocurrency thing? It's totally unrelated to what you normally talk about. I know you have some insight into this. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Bitcoin is a wonderful, wonderful technology. Absolutely, you know, mind-bending and breaking potentially of the way that we see commerce. But when Bitcoin was first introduced, it was, in the hacker community, we tend to release our work before it has gotten to any kind of state of perfection, and we release it all open, and that was the spirit in which it was offered. And the people who were working on it at the beginning immediately saw that it's not perfect for what we were hoping for, even though the whole blockchain idea solved a lot of important problems. But one thing that it was a reason that it wasn't considered to be perfect or what they wanted was because all of the all of the transactions are publicly visible, right? And that has a lot of consequences that you might not imagine right away to be the case. So for example, all of your transactions are linked. So if we got to a wonderful place where you were able to be paid in Bitcoin and you were able to go down to the store and buy your things in Bitcoin, would you want it to be the case that your employer knows where you spend your money? Or would you want it to be the case that your coffee barista is able to tell what kind of salary you make? I think that these are the kinds of consequences that you wouldn't necessarily expect and you wouldn't necessarily want. Another kind of problem that comes up from all of these transactions being linked is that one particular coin, one Bitcoin, has a history. And so you might be able to say, oh, I know that coin was used in Iran, for example, under this leadership, and so I'm not going to support it, or I'm not going to accept that particular Bitcoin from you. So when you have something like cash, even though it has serial numbers on it, theoretically, at least $1 is $1, and you take $1 to the store and you give it to somebody, and no one looks up the serial number and says, "Oh, I know where that dollar's been, and you can't spend that here." So that's a kind of risk you can have with Bitcoin. And so the idea behind my T-shirt is kind of a joke, because whenever something like that comes up, people will say Zcash fixes this, and by this, that is the problem that it means, because it introduces encryption right on the layer that matters for that kind of tracking.
Yeah, I mean, for those people that aren't, everybody always says Bitcoin fixes this and that's whatever world global problem there is, Bitcoin's going to fix it. We see about that, starvation, food system, politics, any of that stuff. All right, so thanks for taking that little diversion, Amber. I always appreciate your insight on so many topics.
Thanks for asking.
So what are you, so Carnivore Conference, you had it, the initial one, and then the world blew up. So what's the latest in the community? Are you still trying to make this stuff happen? Is it going to happen in 2022, or where's things at with regard to that?
That is such a great question, and I'm glad you asked. I don't have anything on the agenda right now, but I'm thinking about having one in 2022. It's true, the world blew up right when I was trying to take CarnivoreCon into its own conference. It was already its own conference, but the way that I made it in 2019, I really wanted more people to have the opportunity to come, and so I put it right after Low Carb Denver on that same, right before, on that same weekend. And then that worked really well, but I wanted to make it its own thing with 2 days, lots of people. And I think a third of the speakers that I had lined up were international, and obviously a lot of the guests were international as well. And so even times when I've thought about trying to bring it back together, I would have to make a whole new speaker list, because I don't think that I can reliably know that most of those people would be able to come. And that's kind of what's been preventing me from putting it on again is all the uncertainty around it. But I am thinking about doing another short 1-day event that is more, it would have to be more local speakers, and try to recreate something of the spirit we had the first time, and then take another run at building it back up into something bigger. But I'm glad to hear that you're interested in that, because a lot of people have started asking me. Things are starting, there seems to be a bit of a thaw, and I'm afraid of, I'm a little afraid of setting something up and having to cancel. What a nightmare that was. But I really want to get it going again.
Yeah, and that was a great service to the community. And I think, yeah, I understand the uncertainty, because there was, an event in Sweden that they had to cancel, that I think you and I are supposed to go to, and it's very frustrating. What about your book? I know you've been working on a book, kind of open source. You kind of one chapter at a time. How's that been going?
Yeah, I've been working on a little under the hood. It, it keeps getting pushed back by other projects. So what I mostly did this year was work on sleep. Actually, I've been interested in sleep for a long time, long before I knew about carnivore. One of the reasons is just that, what the heck is going on with all this, like 1/3 of our lives. But another thing that was interesting to me was back in, I guess, around 2006, I got interested in polyphasic sleep, where people are trying to use sleep frequency throughout the day in order to try to get less need for sleep. The idea being, if you sleep more often, you won't need to sleep as much. There may be some truth to that, but I played around with it quite a bit, especially one particular protocol called Uberman, in which you're actually sleeping for 20 minutes every 4 hours around the clock. And so it adds up to only 2 hours sleep. And being a mother and desperate to get more done, that was really appealing to me. But I tried it a couple of times. I went like 6 days and then collapsed in exhaustion, and I never never made it work for me. But during that time, I started researching a lot about sleep. And one of the things that I learned was that short sleep is used therapeutically for depression. So if you restrict sleep in people with depression, there's a very high rate of successfully putting the depression into remission. But the obvious problem is you can't do it for very long, because they get exhausted, they go back to sleep, and the depression comes right back. So I was really interested in trying to see if I could marry those two ideas and somehow make it so that adding naps would enable you to prolong that. But then I found, of course, the carnivore diet. My own personal problems with depression went away, and I had this whole new other field of things to dive into. And so I kind of completely forgot about sleep for a while. But I recently got interested in trying to figure out what kinds of connections we might be seeing physiologically between ketogenic diets and ketogenic metabolism and sleep, and eating and sleep. And so I put myself through the paces by signing up for a course at CU Boulder here. There was a graduate level course in sleep physiology, which I spent January, February, March, and April doing, and it was a lot of work, and I didn't really get much else done except for that course during that time. But while I was studying that, I was simultaneously looking at what kind of parallels I could draw, or what we could learn about ketogenic diets and sleep. And it turns out that there is not a lot of research on that, but there is a bit. So whenever you're looking at, you want to find out what the effect of a ketogenic diet is on something or other, and there hasn't been a study on that. One of the things you can do, one of the things that some people do is they'll look at like just macronutrients, but I think this can be very misleading, as you and I both know. Like if you look at a study and it says, here's what happens when we or some animals eat very high fat, And then they say, oh, this is what would happen on a ketogenic diet. And often it's like the opposite of what would happen because they're looking at high fat plus high carbs, right? So there were some kind of speculative things about, you know, what does high fat do to sleep? But without having the actual ketogenic context, I don't have very high confidence that that would be the effect of ketogenic diets on sleep. But I did find some work on fasting and some other things in animals, and just a very few studies on the effects of short-term ketogenic-like conditions on sleep. And what I found was really fascinating, actually, to me, because what seems to happen is that ketogenic diets, if you are, there are a few studies that are in a condition where they're looking at people who are sick and are using ketogenic diets for therapy, so like epilepsy or obesity, for example. And in those cases, you'll see that REM sleep will sometimes go down, but actually, or will go up, I'm sorry. But that seems to be only when REM sleep was already compromised. So I don't think that the general case is that a ketogenic diet increases REM sleep, but it seems to normalize it. But in the more general case where we've got a high fat diet or a fasting situation, slow wave sleep is increased and REM sleep is slightly decreased. And this is interesting because slow wave sleep is associated with, and probably causally so, a lot of benefits that people are trying to replicate in other ways. So if you increase slow wave sleep, there may be cognitive benefits, especially if you're in a condition of where there's cognitive decline. There can be benefits in rest and recovery, and there can be benefits in insulin handling, all kinds of physiological things that slow wave sleep seems to be beneficial for. So I actually wrote a paper on that and gave a couple presentations talking about how a ketogenic diet might be a way to therapeutically induce slow wave sleep, more slow wave sleep. Or alternatively, we might say, well, we know that a ketogenic diet is giving these benefits. Maybe the increase in slow wave sleep is one of the ways in which that's happening. So that was my deep dive for the year, and that's mostly what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I looked into sleep for a little while. I wanted to know what carb restriction did on sleep, and I saw that there was, you know, some of the quote unquote deep sleep was enhanced in certain populations, and the REM sleep was either decreased or increased depending on which study you looked at. But it is pretty fascinating. Sleep is obviously, like you said, we spend about a third of our life doing it, so clearly it's important. I mean, one of the things that I've seen is that sleep requirements seem to go down a little bit on a carnivore diet as far as volume. The quality seems to go up, but the requirement goes down. I don't know if that's something you've seen in the folks you've talked to, but that's been my experience. What about your experience with that?
Yeah, I couldn't find anything to really clinically verify that effect, but I've heard that anecdotally a lot as well. And I mean, what I would offer is just that it seems like the quality must be increasing such that the need is less. I can't really think of any other explanation for it.
Okay, what is been you know, you had this issue with, you know, you did the raw meat thing for raw something got you sick for about a year. I think you said it kind of messed you up. Do you find it, I mean, do you find that there's value in uncooked versus cooked enough to sort of justify a potential risk? Do you think there's any actual, because I hear a lot of people saying, you know, you got to eat raw meat. If you're not eating raw meat, you're screwing it up. And I say, well, I can sear the top of it and have it rare and get the same effect in my view. But what are your thoughts around cooked versus uncooked?
Well, definitely, yes, the safety is an issue, and I got really messed up. And to be quite honest, Shawn, I haven't fully recovered from that. I have gained weight from that whole experience that I have not yet lost, although I seem to be finally beginning to get better. But beyond that, I don't know that I could fairly dismiss the ideas that raw is so much better, but I haven't personally seen a lot of evidence to say that why it would be. We've been eating our meat cooked for a very long time. There are certain nutrients, of course, that are lessened by heat, or that could be, like if you, the classic example from Finney pointing out that there was a study where they were given boiled chicken, and then they didn't get enough of the minerals because they threw out the water after. So there's certainly effects like that where some of the nutrients can be lost. But like you said, I mean, if you're searing it and you're cooking it to medium rare, for example, that's certainly a low enough temperature that vitamin C, for example, doesn't seem to be degraded. And you know, there are arguments about the quality of the proteins. I'm a little bit skeptical about those, because protein folding, for example, is something that your digestive system is going to optimize away anyway. Like, I'm not sure why the amino acid content, for example, would be any different if the protein's gotten folded from cooking. Now, you know, as I've said a couple times, maybe I haven't seen all the literature about it, but I haven't done a deep dive, but I haven't seen anything so far that has made me think that you would have to eat raw to get the benefits. I mean, obviously, I didn't need to eat raw to get the benefits. The reason that I eat raw is just because I like it. I mean, I think in our society, sushi and sashimi is fairly well accepted as food that we would eat raw, and most people maybe don't bat an eye at it, but eating your ground beef raw is not something that we tend to do in North America. But every culture, if you look at them, they'll have some kind of raw food dish that is completely normal. So you know, on the one hand, I think it's probably not that important, but on the other hand, it's not that abnormal either. I like the taste of it better.
Yeah, I mean,
is
I've
where I was
certainly,
going to go.
yeah, I mean, certainly a nice, you know, carpaccio or something like that is can be very nice. Let me ask you, this is maybe an unrelated topic, and I want to see what your thoughts are on this. But recently, I think it was the FDA that came out saying that we're going to have a massive push to limit sodium consumption, because there's epidemiologic data that indicates that reducing sodium is good for human beings. My sort of thought on that is probably most of our sodium comes from eating processed, and I know the word processed is a bone of contention. You know, just
I
junk
won't
food.
give you a hard time about that.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, it's kind of what it's like pornography. Junk food, you know it when you see it, but you know, it's hard to put a name on that. But for whatever reason, we're eating too much of that stuff. You know, the Doritos and the stuff that has a high sodium. But what are your thoughts on this restriction on sodium? Is that sort of a miscue, or do you think there's some legitimate reason we should all be restricting sodium in addition to or independent of the junk food?
That's a good question. So I'm of at least two minds about that. So a lot of the the arguments that people have brought forth that we should restrict sodium don't seem to, for the most part, hold much weight. A lot of them are epidemiological, but then again, when I've looked at other people's epidemiological work, they're showing that even in this carb-based society, it's actually a higher level of salt intake is associated with better health than a lot of the studies seem to be saying. So there's a contradiction in there. But in a certain sense, it's all kind of a moot point, because at least for us, we're not the population that epidemiology has been done on. So whether or not high salt is good or bad based on those studies, it seems like we can't even get the information that we need from that. One thing that I have noticed is that going from a ketogenic to a carnivore diet, a lot of people who I know who have been on a carnivore diet for a long time have stopped eating salt for whatever reason and have found that they just didn't need as much as they did on a ketogenic diet. And there may be different reasons for that. I mean, one reason might be that you needed salt at the beginning because you were adjusting ketogenically, and it's known that you can lose salt during that whole process. And so maybe it's just that they've been on the diet long enough that they don't actually need salt anymore. But other reasons might include just that meat itself has a high level of sodium, that there could be balances. So plants tend to have a much higher level of potassium, and having less potassium might mean that you need less sodium. Another possible contributor is drinking. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, a lot of people are drinking flavored and sweetened drinks that, because they are enjoyable in and of themselves, might cause them to just drink more fluid. And the more fluid that you drink, the more salt that you need. Salt and water kind of go together. And so if you stop drinking all those things that you're drinking just for pleasure and only drinking to thirst, you might drink less, and therefore you might need less sodium. And then another maybe more speculative idea is that, well, we know that herbivores need to go out and seek salt, right? And we know that carnivores don't really do that. So if you find a mineral lick, which is largely sodium, the animals that attract are herbivores. So what is the reason for that? Well, one reason that I have read about in the literature that it's a speculation, but it's not untrue, is that plants require a lot of detoxification, right? And the detoxification process may require more sodium than it would be if you were not eating those plants. So another reason that our salt needs might go down on a carnivore diet could be simply that we don't need the sodium for processing the plants in that way. On the other hand, I know lots of carnivores who still eat lots of salt and seem to feel better when they eat that, and I think it's something to play with. Like anything, like sugar, when you first take it away, you're going to miss it and you're going to feel like everything seems bland without it. But then after a few days or a week or something, you start to taste more. And I think that process definitely happens with salt habituation.
Yeah, good point, Samber, on that. Yeah, because I have seen people that have, said that they just completely eliminated salt, and we do have a lot. I mean, we have a lot of salt in our muscle and our tissue and our blood. I mean, our blood is basically isoosmotic with seawater, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So it's pretty similar on that. So let me ask you about. You can decline if you want, but we are in the middle of a pandemic. We still see no sort of nationwide or organized push to talk about health. I mean, we're talking about, this is something you can do, but health needs to be overlooked. I mean, you recovered from mental health issues and probably improved metabolic health. You've seen that happen, I mean, over and over again. And we still are completely reluctant to talk about that on a national scale. Do you find that to be interesting or frustrating, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I'm hearing your question right, I definitely agree that our basal health is one of the most important factors in our immune capabilities, right? If it's the people who are sick already who are going to be the most vulnerable to any kind of disease process. And I will share with you, this is pure anecdote, but when I first went carnivore, I didn't get a viral illness for 8 years. And that was pretty mind-blowing to me, because before that, you know, I got a cold a couple times a year, I'm sure. I had cold sores, which are obviously a virus, which I would get about once a year. And I have children in school, and they would bring home flus and or stomach, I don't know if it's actually influenza, but all kinds of things. And I would get them, and people would talk about how, like, every year people would say, oh, there's a really bad one going around this year. And it was always true, right? There's always something going around. But when my health improved, my susceptibility to those went way down. So obviously, the healthier you are, the more the more the stronger you're going to be in the face of any kind of epidemic. You know, I'm reluctant to say too much about COVID in particular, because it can be so contentious, and people will tend to jump down your throat whatever you say. But I will say that being metabolically healthy takes a little bit longer than other kinds of measures. So if you come up with any kind of sickness, you can't turn on a dime and become healthy. And so I think it's fair to say, you know, we need to have other kinds of measures, especially in any kind of emergency or urgent situation. And you know, no matter how healthy you are, if you get sick with something, you still want there to be treatments for that. But as a public health issue, I do think that we absolutely undermine or appreciate what basic, like just basic health could do for the population as a whole. And not just for viral illnesses, but for all of the epidemics that we have, cancer and heart disease. Everything will be better off if the population is healthier.
Yeah, we clearly have. I mean, we're seeing pretty disturbing statistics coming out with regard to, you know, just obesity is continuing to go to where I think in 2030 you're projecting fully 50% of the U.S. population will be obese, which is, you know, and you're approaching the majority now. And so we've kind of redefined, you know, what the human experience and existence is. You know, I think I think 2 generations from now, kids won't even probably understand that is kind of an abnormal human state, or at least I would argue it is. Let me, you know, so what other things have you been up to, Amber? I know you said you got a lot of iron in the fire, so tell me about, if you don't mind discussing some of the other ones.
Sure. Let's see. I'm continuing to write for my book, and I've been collaborating on another book project. I'm not sure I'm at liberty to say, so I'll just say I'm working on a chapter for someone else that I will be happy to announce soon. I went to my first in-person conference in a long time at AHS in August, and I did wax on the sleep issue there. I went into more speculative territory about the connections between satiety and sleep, and how ROS oxidation may have a role in there, and uncoupling processes. That was really cool and fun. And then my second in-person conference since the bad times will be at Low Carb USA in Boca, and that's coming up in January. So I'm excited about that too.
Oh, nice. I'm actually in Florida right now in Miami, and so it's pleasant here. I had to spend time on the beach this morning, and so good for you. That's awesome to hear that. Do you have any? Well, I mean, with regard to mental health, I mean, I'm sure you obviously have looked into this, you know, at a significant to a significant degree, just because that's something that you know, essentially solved through diet. Any more sort of thoughts on what mechanistically is going on mental health wise, you know, and is it, you know, with changing the diet, is it gut, is it nutrition, is it, inflammation? Is it all the above? What's compelling to you? What data out there is compelling to you that can kind of say we use diet to treat, not only to, treat health, but mental health, because it's such an overlooked topic. I know we got guys like Chris Palmer at Harvard doing some research on ketogenic diets and things like schizophrenia and so on and so forth. But what are your thoughts on what's going on with mental health?
Yeah, there are a lot of different kind of interacting pieces there, and I really wish that we had more studies to show that the kind of experience that I've had is not a complete anomaly. I don't I obviously don't think it is, because it was such a profound thing for me. Yeah, and it's interesting to me because a ketogenic diet for me personally wasn't enough to get there. My psychiatric disease was progressing under mere low carb, high fat. It wasn't until I took the plants out of the picture that I got this effect. But there's always at least two sides to that. There's the removing the plants and different mechanisms, how they might be contributing to some kind of problem, and the extra nutrition that you get from, because if I'm eating fewer plants, I'm obviously eating a lot more meat, and a different kind of fat profile, so all of that could be contributing. We've looked at there are a lot of epidemiological or observational studies in vegans, which has been showing that there's at least a correlation between plant-only diets or lack of meat in the diet and mental health problems. And that would tend to suggest that it's something in the meat that is more necessary. But then from the ketogenic perspective, you mentioned Chris Palmer and people who are looking at ketosis as a therapy. Well, we know that the brain really thrives on that. It could be a matter of there being some kind of insulin resistance in the brain, or glucose intolerance, which is really putting a limit on the amount of energy that the brain can use. And if your brain is running out of energy, that's going to impact all of your functions. And I can certainly see depression in particular coming out of that. And then, so if you have that kind of problem and you're able to provide ketones as a quote unquote alternative fuel, I don't necessarily like using the word alternative because it reinforces that default, but let's just say it that way. If you have something else to use, then that could be all you needed to get you out of the space of not enough energy being available. I mean, the brain is a supreme user of energy. If we know nothing else about it, we know that.
Yeah, I just had something I wanted to ask you and I just forgot, Amber. Yeah, this is what I'm going to ask you about. Okay. There are some people speculating, well, they've been for a long time, that prolonged ketosis is bad for humans. We shouldn't do that. And therefore we should periodically, fill up our glycogen by eating fruit and honey and some kind of carbohydrate. What are your thoughts about that? Is ketosis and being in a ketogenic state, or the absence of carbohydrates over a long period of time, is it likely to cause damage? And if not, why not?
Yeah, this kind of argument pops up from time to time. I've seen some wrestling about it recently, although I didn't yet examine what the exact arguments are for it this time around. Typically, I think people talk about, I'm going to put it this way. Almost everything that we know about the ketogenic state comes from experiments in fasting or starvation, or we're looking at other animals who do not have as much ketogenic capacity as humans do. And so to get those animals into a constant chronic ketogenic state requires giving them like inadequate protein or chronic caloric restriction, or things of that nature that obviously have other other problems and components that go along with that. So if you look at all of these physiological things as stressors, as components of starvation, then you're going to have the view that they would be dangerous. But the fact is that human beings, for whatever reason, have an extraordinary ability to stay in a ketogenic state, even when we're fully fed, even when we're getting far more protein than you would arguably need just to maintain, your basic lean mass. As long as you're not eating a lot of carbohydrate, as long as you're eating enough fat, and as long as protein isn't, astronomically high, you're going to be in ketosis. And I don't see in humans any compelling argument to say that this would be a bad state. We are getting our muscle glycogen refilled. We are meeting all of our nutritional needs. And there's no, I guess it's unfortunate that I haven't seen the latest round of arguments against it to argue against, but things that I've seen in the past, for example, would be arguing that thyroid goes low and that this would be bad. And, T3 does go down in a ketogenic state, but that is simply a reflection of, as far as I can tell, need for carbohydrate processing. And so you're back to that situation that we talked about in the beginning, where you have this set of labs that were based on a high grain-based, high carbohydrate metabolism, and we associate each of these markers with health. And then when those markers become different, people worry about what kind of effect it has when we don't, we don't have the proper comparison to say that those things are necessarily bad. I just don't think that we have enough data against it to say that that a ketogenic state for long periods would be harmful. Now, if somebody finds that they eat some carbohydrates and they feel better, I would have at least two responses to it. Like, one is, is there any reason why you shouldn't continue to do that? Like, was it a trade-off? Something felt better, but something wasn't as good. And if so, then maybe you could look into seeing if there is some way that you can change the way that you're composing your ketogenic diet to get those benefits without giving up the trade-off. So one common example is, a lot of people don't eat enough or don't eat enough fat, and so they're not getting enough energy in their diet. And when you're not getting enough energy in your diet chronically, you're going to feel bad. And if you suddenly eat carbohydrates, which provides a lot of energy really quickly, you might feel better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't have figured out a way to achieve that with your ketogenic diet. But if there's no trade-off and you feel strictly better, then I'm not going to argue against doing that. If eating some fruit and honey in addition to your animal-based diet, I guess, strictly makes you feel better, then I wouldn't be one to tell you not to do it.
Yeah, well said. I think it's one of those. I often see people that because they come to the diet, trying to lose a lot of weight, and they kind of so used to restricting so much that they undereat, and they end up with all kinds of problems associated with not taking in enough food. I guess, what was I going to say? Yeah, so it's kind of funny, watch the low carb community, and you have all these little trends and sort of things that go into the latest trend, and we kind of sort of touched on this, is this sort of protein sparing modified fast. A lot of people are adopting that. Maria Emmerich has a new cookbook. She has a cookbook for every trend that comes out or something, and good for her. She's an excellent recipe maker. But I mean, that's something that we're seeing a lot of. Do you see any potential downside from the protein sparing modified fast or any concerns about it? I mean, a lot of people use it as a short-term utility, but what are your thoughts on that particular strategy?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I don't necessarily think that what the Emmerichs are advocating for is what I would call a protein sparing modified fast. So protein sparing modified fast is a technical term. It's old, it's not new. It's basically what happened was, in the spirit of this research of fasting and getting these benefits of the ketogenic state, there's the obvious immediate downside that you're not getting enough nutrition, and very specifically, you're losing lean mass if you're fasting, and that can be dangerous. I mean, it can be really dangerous. So there was a time where people were doing fasting or very low protein, and what happens is, when you're in that ketogenic state, or what you might call phase 2 starvation, all the glycogen is gone, but you still have ample fat. You still obviously need a little bit of protein. You're still going to be in negative nitrogen balance because you're using up some protein, and the body does that fairly indiscriminately. And if you're not getting enough protein on a what I'm sure daily isn't exactly necessary, but if you're not regularly getting enough protein, your body's going to break down your heart tissue, basically. And so what happens is that in an animal, a non-human animal that doesn't have a lot of fat, like most animals, if you put them through starvation, they'll go through three periods. First, their glycogen and what they just ate gets used up. The second part is they use up their fat, and that happens usually very quickly in other animals. And the third part, they start actually actively catabolizing their lean tissue. When that happens, there's a surge in hormones asking them, you know, this is your last chance. You've got to go out and get some food now or you're going to die. But in that middle period where you're using up fat, you're also making a slow drain on protein. In most animals, that doesn't matter, because if you're not going to die in that period. But in an animal that has a lot of fat, like an obese human, the slow drain on your protein can actually cause you to die of starvation before you get to the last stage of starvation, because of that strain on your lean mass. So the researchers wanted to design a way to do a fast, but to spare the protein. So it literally means eat enough protein to make this diet viable, and eat nothing else, like eat as little as possible, eat just enough protein to do that, and nothing else. And that was what these studies were based on. So doing that, I think, is probably hard on the body, because you may not actually be getting enough energy, because you're limited in fat oxidation by, first of all, if you're one of those people, like I mentioned earlier, who has high insulin, even if you have a lot of fat on your body, you may not be able to release it as well, or you may not be able to oxidize it as well, because insulin dampens both of those activities. So adding some fat on top of that can mitigate that problem. And the other thing is, you want to be careful about making sure that you are actually getting adequate protein. So that's a real historical protein sparing modified fast. But a lot of people are using the word protein sparing modified fast to mean, instead of that, eating as much protein as you want and severely limiting your fat intake. So it's basically, it's like ad libitum, but only protein. And I think that this actually can work really well for a lot of people, except for those people who, as I've said a few times now, are having trouble accessing their own body fat. And if you're in that situation, or if you're, for example, post-diabetic or pre-diabetic, or have diabetes in your history, eating that protein can mess with your blood sugar in a way that is not going to be positive overall. But you know, I want to be positive and say that for a lot of people, this approach, especially if you do it in the short term or just do it sometimes, it's a proven thing in many, you know, in the bodybuilding community for a long time that this can help you lose fat. But as a long-term strategy, I would worry about not getting enough fat nutrition and about you know, the effects on your fat-based things like cholesterol, sex hormones, your brain, and all of those things. I would caution about doing that for too long a time.
Yeah, it's one thing, you know, is I guess I'm soon to be 55, and so I start worrying about end of, not hopefully not end of life, but the later parts of life. And one of the things we see is, you know, dementia is becoming more and more present. I mean, what are your thoughts on dementia prevention or mitigation, or have you looked into that very much with regard to brain function and fat versus glucose versus insulin resistance and on?
I haven't. I mean, there's obviously a lot of information about Alzheimer's as being a kind of third diabetes, it's sometimes called, where there's this connection of the glucose. And I think that there's merit to that. I mean, people like Cunane have put Alzheimer's patients on ketogenic diets and you're getting some improvement. But I think the brain often, we're so good at compensating for our deficits that a problem in the brain often doesn't show up until it's gotten to a very extreme level. Like you'll just get pushed over the edge, and all of these compensating mechanisms that were covering up for issues that were going on for a long time all of a sudden come into view. And one thing I guess I would just mention is back a connection to sleep and getting enough of the deep sleep. One of the things that happens during deep sleep, and we don't understand all of the mechanisms, but one thing that has come to light is that during deep sleep, there's, I like to think of it as brain washing, because what happens is the tissues, the extracellular tissues expand so that more cerebral spinal fluid can come in and clear out metabolites and clear out, actually can clear out amyloid. And what I think is happening is that there's repair going on during that time. If you're not getting enough of that sleep, then that process isn't going to happen as well. And so that's one way that a ketogenic diet can help with something like Alzheimer's or dementia that has nothing to do with the whole energetic basis or what fuel you're burning, but more about increasing these other health parameters that are part of the way that we deal with the onslaught of just of life, you know, the metabolic consequences of everything that happens in your brain.
Yeah. So Amber, what I mean, what I would ask is, what in the last, say, you know, you've been doing this carnivore diet now for, correct me if I'm wrong, about 12 years, I think, something in that neighborhood. And
Yep.
have you changed your mind significantly on any particular topic since you started this? Have you, I mean, because, you know, back when you were doing it, it was obviously a small community, and, you know, we have the guys like you know, Owsley Stanley, the Bear, and, you know, a few other people pontificating on this. And obviously we've seen a lot of people now that have done carnivore, or, and I know you like to point out, there's a lot of people doing a carnivore diet when it's not truly a carnivore diet, where they're, you know, adding all these things, and you like to keep that, you know, that dichotomy pure. And I think there's a reason for that. But have you sort of backtracked, changed, thought things are much different than when you first started?
Well, if I said no, that would sound like I'm not very open-minded. I think most of my positions are probably the same, but one thing that has changed for me is that I've become a little more, I've embraced a little more humility, because I used to think that a carnivore diet could basically cure anything, and that if people weren't getting results, it's because they were not doing it right. And I came upon that innocently because, for one thing, it was so effective for me, and for another thing, I met many, even in my personal life, very intelligent individuals who made easy mistakes to make. For example, this wouldn't be carnivore, but a lot of people I know thought that legumes or nuts or things would be free foods on a ketogenic diet and not realize that they had carbohydrates. So simple things like that, I thought would account for why people might go to a carnivore diet and continue to have problems. But I guess I'm kind of learn the hard way person. And so not only have I interacted with a lot of people who I think really did a good faith effort and didn't have everything that they wanted resolved, but I had my own issues that a carnivore diet by itself wasn't an immediate cure for. And so I just feel a lot more humble and a lot more sympathetic and empathetic in that way, and more open-minded about other ways of eating being potentially even better for some people than a carnivore diet, which is surprisingly hard for me to say.
When you said there's things outside of diet, I mean, obviously you just kind of mentioned sleep, but there's a lot of, what things have you discovered that then, assuming you said you didn't fix everything with the diet, but you maybe tried some other things, what things have been effective for you?
Well, one of the things that happened to me when I had those terrible infections is that I had post-infectious IBS for a very long time, which meant that I was having terrible digestive issues, and eventually this it was not only an inconvenience in the bathroom, but it started making, I started having symptoms of severe fatigue and problems like that I eventually realized were just a consequence of not being able to absorb nutrients. So for example, I started taking some nutrient supplements that fixed some of those ongoing problems that I believe were just a consequence of malabsorption. So I'm a lot more sympathetic to the idea of taking supplements. I've never been against them exactly, but I think that often people throw in supplements as a kind of insurance policy, and that can be a mistake because supplements are, if you don't need them, they could muck with things because there are interactions. Taking more of this means that you might need more of something else, and there can be, even just clinically, sometimes taking supplements, even just plain old vitamins, can be associated with a poorer outcome. But that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where if you have an ongoing problem and it isn't being resolved, you may need that extra help, and there's nothing wrong with doing that.
Let me just talk about one specific example. We hear a lot about vitamin D. I looked at this old study on Inuits from Greenland that was done in the 1920s, where they compared the presence or absence of clinical vitamin D deficiency in kids, specifically rickets. And they saw, despite both groups, they had looked at two different groups. Both groups had what we would consider low vitamin D levels. However, one was exposed to processed foods, one was on a traditional diet. Even with the same vitamin D serum levels, the group that was exposed to processed foods developed rickets, where the ones that weren't exposed to that did not. And so I just kind of think that some of this stuff, again, is conditional. Even the serum levels are conditional. What are your thoughts on vitamin D supplements? Let's say you got somebody in a carnivore diet that lives in, Saskatchewan, and they don't get much sun. And is it something you think is necessary, or what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I take your point about serum levels not necessarily reflecting the whole picture of what's going on. Like with a lot of things, it could be the case that your body is trying to keep a certain serum level, and it doesn't necessarily reflect all of the activity that's going on to keep it at that level. But with that caveat, if I see someone who has low vitamin D levels, I think it's a safe and potentially really helpful thing to do. And I have, in certain cases in my personal life, where people were having specific problems and were found to have vitamin D, told them, you should take vitamin D to get your levels up and then see what's happening. Obviously, I wouldn't guarantee that it would solve a problem or that it wouldn't cause a problem, but as far as I can tell, it's a safe and probably beneficial move to get your vitamin D levels up. And I don't think that everyone can do that by sun. I mean, it's not just where you live, but for example, I'm a pasty pale Irish descendant, and I can't tolerate as much sun as a lot of other people, and so I just don't have that choice.
Yeah, one thing that was interesting, I recently had some vitamin D levels assessed, and it was actually broken down by vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 obviously being the animal-based source, and the D2 is typically what we see when we eat plant-based vitamin D, or sometimes the food additives. Literally 100% of my vitamin D was a vitamin D3. The total and the vitamin D level were exactly the same. And so I wonder, when we look at these total numbers, it's looking at vitamin D plus vitamin D2, D3 plus vitamin D2, and maybe those numbers are, it might be interesting to break those down by, what's actually, in the blood, whether it's 3 or 2. So that's just an interesting caveat.
That's a really good point. Yeah, we talk about that a bit more with vitamin K. I've seen where the animal source it does different things, and it's a better, in many ways, much better source. But I don't think we talk about that enough in vitamin D.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if that has an impact. I've read that the vitamin D3 is better converted into the active form, and therefore maybe more usable. I can't remember the percentage, but it's significantly better converted. So maybe we need to break it down by vitamin D3 levels in the blood rather than just the aggregate. Amber, we've kept you over an hour, and my apologies for getting this started a little bit late. I want to be respectful of your time, but thank you so much for doing this, Amber. Tell us where people can find you, social media. I know that the book you're producing, you're putting online, where people can go to do that, and anything else you'd like to share.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. I always like talking to you. My blog is mostly-fat.com, which tells you a little bit about my biases. There's a link to the book from there. And then I spend entirely too much time on Twitter. So if you want to interact with me, you probably can there while I'm procrastinating on other things.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber. And thanks, everybody. Enjoy your Sunday. I'll be back tomorrow. I should be able to figure out the internet a lot quicker tomorrow since anyway, thanks, everybody, guys. Have a great day. And I got a steak waiting for me. I'm going to go eat. So see everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Join Revero.health for a 30-day free trial to get access to live Q&A with VIP guests, social community meetings, member discounts, low-carb healthcare providers list, forum, workouts, monthly challenges, early access to podcasts, recipes, carnivore diet guide, fasting guide, shred guide, and much more.